Welcome back to the Daily Dose. We got day number 99 going on today. We are one day away from 100. And do you know what our scripture is for today? If you don't, you need to go down below and click on the PDF file in the link in the description. That'll tell you what our scripture is that we're reading each day. So for today, we've got 1 Kings 17 through 19, also Psalm number 99. Today we are introduced to a guy named Elijah. Elijah is one of the prime-time big boy prophets of the Old Testament. So here's the deal, right? Now remember, Ahab was reigning over Israel. Ahab was the wicked king who was reigning over the Israel tribes, which were the 10 to the north. Okay, so enter Elijah, stage right. Elijah prophesies against Ahab, and he basically says, look, because of your wickedness and because of the anger of the Lord, it is not going to rain for about 3 years. There's going to be a drought. What happens when there's a drought? There's normally a famine because there's a shortage of food because the crops and the grains are not growing. They can't provide water for all of the animals, so on and so forth. Then we read that Elijah gets fed by ravens, of all things. It's kind of bizarre, huh? So basically God tells Elijah, hey, you need to go off into the wilderness. You need to go up in the woods and just hang out there for a while. And ravens bring bread and meat. So ravens end up feeding Elijah. In the morning they bring him bread and they bring him meat. And in the evening they bring him bread and they bring him meat, which is kind of interesting, but that's how God chooses to provide for Elijah. And Elijah gets his water from a brook that's nearby. He drinks from this brook. So after we read that little tidbit about Elijah being fed by the ravens, we read about Elijah and the widow at Zarephath. Zarephath was a town, and so, as this drought goes on, the brook ends up drying up, the brook where Elijah had been getting his water from. So God pretty much tells him, look, you need to go relocate. God speaks to this widow that is in the town of Zarephath and says, hey, I've got this prophet that's going to be coming your way, and you need to take care of him. You need to feed him. So Elijah ends up making his way to this town, finds this widow, and he's like, hey, you're supposed to feed me. And the widow says, I don't have anything to feed you with. All I've got is a jar with a little bit of flour and a little bit of oil, and I don't have enough to feed you, bro. So we see a miracle happen here. Essentially, God provides for Elijah and the widow in such a way that her flour jar and her oil jar never run empty. Whenever she takes out oil and flour to bake some bread or some cakes or whatever it was that they made with that back then, whenever she would go back the next day to make more, there would be more in there. It was basically like a never-ending jar of flour and olive oil, almost like the manna, how God provided in the wilderness. So during the course of Elijah's stay with this widow, the widow's son dies, and we read that Elijah prays to God, and God brings this boy back to life. So we're seeing somebody being raised up from the dead, right? So again, this guy Elijah, very, very interesting character. We see him doing very similar things to the things that Jesus did. We see him multiplying food and multiplying oil. Jesus multiplied the wine, turned the water into wine. Jesus fed the many with just a small little couple loaves of bread and a couple fish. He was able to multiply that. We see the same type of thing happening in Elijah's time. So after we read about the widow's son being brought back to life, now we read about Elijah and this character named Obadiah. Okay, so God sends Elijah to appear before Ahab, and Obadiah was Ahab's palace administrator, basically, for lack of a better term. However, we know that Ahab was a very wicked, wicked man. This Obadiah guy was actually a righteous guy. He was a devout believer in the God of Israel. We also find out here that Jezebel, Ahab's equally wicked wife, she had been killing prophets. Apparently, she had been on some sort of a rampage, just going around killing any prophet that she could get her hands on. Well, Obadiah hid 100 prophets in 2 caves. So he divided these prophets up, probably 50 in one group, 50 in another, and he brought them to these caves to basically hide them out. And somehow Obadiah managed to provide food for them, to sustain them and keep them alive while they were hiding out. So Elijah ends up running into this Obadiah guy in the hills. And Obadiah is like, oh, wow, Elijah's here. What's really going on? So I guess Obadiah runs back and tells Ahab, hey, I just ran into Elijah, and Elijah's over there. You might want to go talk to him. So when Obadiah tells Ahab that, he's afraid that Ahab is going to kill him, right? Because this dude Ahab, he was wicked to begin with. He didn't like Elijah because of the prophecy that Elijah gave about, the drought and this, that, and the other. So, Obadiah's afraid, hey, if I go tell Ahab that Elijah has been found, maybe that'll spark some anger in Ahab, and he'll take his anger out initially on me before he moves on to try to take it out on Elijah. So now we come to an interesting story about Elijah on Mount Carmel. Okay, so Obadiah basically tells Ahab, and Ahab says, okay, I'll go meet Elijah. I'll go see what he's got to say. So Ahab goes out there to meet Elijah at Mount Carmel. So basically, they decide that they're going to do a challenge to see whose God is the real God, to see whose God is the more powerful God. Baal, the false gods that Ahab and his people have been serving, or what we know as the true God, the God of Israel. So the challenge is this, right? Basically, the false prophets of Ahab, they are supposed to sacrifice an animal, and they're going to put it on an altar. And then same thing, Elijah is going to sacrifice an animal, and he's going to put it on a separate altar. All right? So you've got 2 altars with 2 sacrifices. The way this is supposed to play out is that whichever side's God would be able to basically make the sacrifice spontaneously combust and go up in flames, that side, their God, would be dominant, right? So if Ahab's false prophets could pray, and if they could somehow make the sacrifice light up and go up in flames, then that would prove that they were superior. If Elijah could pray to God, and if the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, if he could make Elijah's sacrifice burn up on fire, then that would show that Elijah's God was superior, okay? So Ahab's little Baal prophets try all day long, right? They're praying, they're doing all kinds of little rituals and dancing around and, whatever. Elijah actually ends up mocking them. He's like, oh, maybe you need to cry a little louder. Maybe your God is sleeping, And so these Baal, the false Baal prophets, they start like cutting themselves and jabbing themselves, and they're letting blood all over the place, thinking that that's going to appease their God to do what they're trying to get him to do. So after that fails, right, after the day goes by, and meanwhile, Ahab and Baal and their false god has been unable to set this offering ablaze, Elijah says, okay, now it's my turn. You guys ready? Elijah basically tells the people to go get buckets of water and dump buckets of water on his offering to make it that much harder to be set on fire, because he wants them to know beyond the shadow of a doubt, hey, this is a miracle from God. So God ends up torching it. After the sacrifice is soaking wet, God sets it on fire, and it just goes up in flames. At this point, the people are afraid because they realize, wow, this is some serious business, and I guess we've been serving the wrong God. Shame on us. So Elijah has the people go round up all of these false Baal prophets that he was competing against, and he has them killed. From there, we read a story about Elijah fleeing to Horeb. Okay, so after the situation with the competition, for lack of a better term, between Baal, the false god, and the true God of Israel. After that happens, excuse me, my eyes are kind of dry. I felt like I had an eyelash in there too. Much better. Okay, so after Ahab is embarrassed and his God is embarrassed, he goes and runs to Jezebel and says, "Oh, Jezebel, I'm embarrassed. You're not going to believe what Elijah did. You know, this, that, and the other. He killed all of our prophets. He made us look like fools," so on and so forth. So Jezebel, who I believe is the one that really wore the pants in the family, she ends up vowing that she's going to have Elijah killed. So Elijah finds out about this, and he flees. And then we read a little story about the angel of the Lord appearing to Elijah. He appears twice, and he encourages him to eat and gather his strength because there's a long journey coming up. And he takes a 40-day journey to Horeb. Elijah does. And then after that, the Lord appears to Elijah, and God tells him basically to anoint this person named Hazael over a town called Aram, and to anoint Jehu over Israel. And he is also told to appoint another soon-to-be prophet named Elisha as his successor. Okay, so we've got Elijah and Elisha. Very confusing. Elijah was the first one. Elisha was his successor. So the last little section of today's scripture we read is about the call of Elisha. So Elijah goes to recruit Elisha, and Elisha basically follows him and becomes his apprentice, his disciple, sort of, for lack of a better term. And that's kind of where we wrap up in today's reading material. So I will leave you guys with that for today, and we will be back again tomorrow to continue on and have some more fun in the Daily Dose. So until we meet again, my friends, deuces.